The flames danced higher than the tallest trees in the village, painting the night sky orange and red. Little Cale stood frozen behind his mother's torn dress, watching his father burn alive in the center of the village square. The boy was only 7 years old, but his dark eyes held a depth that seemed much older as he witnessed the most terrible moment of his young life. The raiders had come without warning, just as the evening meal was being prepared. Cale's father, Marcus, had been the village blacksmith and the closest thing they had to a leader. When the armed men on horseback thundered into their peaceful settlement, Marcus had stepped forward to protect his people. He carried nothing but a hammer in his weathered hands, facing down 20 warriors with swords and spears. "Please," Marcus had said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Take what you want, but leave the children alone." The village had maybe 60 people in total, mostly farmers and their families who had built their homes in this quiet valley because they wanted to live in peace. The leader of the raiders, a scarred man with cold blue eyes, had laughed at Marcus's request. "We take everything," he had snarled. "Your grain, your animals, your women, and your lives." Without another word, he had ordered his men to tie Marcus to the wooden post in the village center. Cale's mother, Elena, had tried to cover her son's eyes, but the boy had pushed her hands away. Something inside him knew he needed to see this. He needed to remember every detail of what was happening to his father, the way the flames started small at Marcus's feet, the way his father refused to scream, even as the fire climbed higher, the way Marcus looked directly at Cale in those final moments, his lips moving to form words the boy couldn't hear over the crackling of the fire. "I will come back for you," Marcus seemed to be saying. "Be strong, my son." The other villagers wept and begged, but they were too few and too weak to fight back. The raiders had killed the 3 other men who tried to help Marcus. Now they watched in horror as their protector burned before their eyes. Some of the women fainted from the sight. The elderly village priest fell to his knees, praying loudly for God to strike down the evil men who had brought this terror to their peaceful home. But little Cale did not cry. He did not pray. He simply watched and remembered every face of every raider, every word they spoke, every cruel laugh that escaped their lips as his father died. The boy's small hands clenched into fists at his sides, and something hard and cold settled in his chest like a stone. After Marcus died, the raiders spent 3 days destroying everything the villagers had built. They burned houses, stole livestock, and took any young women they wanted. They killed anyone who tried to stop them. By the time they rode away, the village was nothing but ash and sorrow. Of the 60 people who had lived there, only 35 survived. Elena held her son close as they stood among the ruins of their home. "We must go," she whispered. "We cannot stay here." She had relatives in a town 3 days' walk to the north. It was their only hope for survival. But as they prepared to leave with the other survivors, Cale turned back to look at the blackened post where his father had died. The wood was still warm from the fire. The ground around it was stained dark with blood and ash. The boy knelt down and pressed his small hand into the earth, making a silent promise that only he could hear. "I will remember," he whispered. "I will remember everything." The journey north was hard for the survivors. They had no food except what they could find along the way. No shelter except what they could build from branches and leaves. Many of the older people became sick. 2 of them died before they reached the town where Elena's sister lived. Kyle's aunt, Maria, welcomed them into her small house, but space was tight. There were already 6 people living there, and now they had to make room for Elena and Cale as well. Maria's husband, Roberto, was a kind man who worked as a carpenter. He tried to help Cale adjust to his new life, teaching him to use tools and helping him learn to read better. But the boy was different now. The other children in the town noticed it right away. Cale no longer played games or laughed at jokes. He spent his time learning everything he could about fighting and weapons. He watched the town guards practice with their swords. He listened carefully when travelers spoke of wars and battles in distant lands. "He's too serious for a child," Maria worried to her sister. "He should be playing with the other boys his age." Elena understood her son's pain, but she didn't know how to help him. "He saw things no child should see," she replied sadly. "I think part of him died with his father that night." As months passed, Cale grew taller and stronger. He helped Roberto in his workshop, learning to build and repair things. But his real education came from the stories told by soldiers and merchants who passed through the town. They spoke of distant kingdoms where boys could train to become warriors. They told tales of great battles where small armies defeated much larger ones through clever planning and fierce determination. The boy listened to every word, storing the information away like precious treasure. In his mind, he was already planning for the day when he would be old enough to leave this quiet town. He knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life. He would find others like himself, people who had lost everything to raiders and bandits. He would train them to fight. And then he would hunt down every evil man who preyed on peaceful villages. At night, when everyone else was sleeping, Cale would sneak outside and practice fighting with sticks and stones. He imagined his father watching him, guiding his movements. The memory of that terrible burning night never left him. But instead of making him weak, it made him determined to become stronger than any enemy he might face. 5 years had passed since that terrible night, and Cale was now 12 years old. His body had grown lean and strong from years of secret training and hard work in Roberto's carpentry shop. But his eyes still held that same cold determination that had appeared the night he watched his father burn. The other children in the town had stopped trying to befriend him long ago. They found his intensity frightening. Everything changed the day Captain Aldrich arrived in town. The grizzled old soldier had served in 3 different wars and bore scars from countless battles. He was traveling north to visit his daughter when his horse went lame, forcing him to stay in town for several days while the animal recovered. Roberto was asked to repair the captain's damaged saddle, and Cale met the warrior while delivering the finished work. "You have the eyes of a fighter," Captain Aldrich observed, studying the boy carefully. "But also the anger of someone who has lost much." The captain had seen many young men destroyed by rage, but something about Cale was different. The boy's anger was controlled, purposeful. Cale looked directly at the weathered soldier without fear. "I want to learn to fight," he said simply. "I want to learn to kill bad men." Most adults would have been shocked by such words from a 12-year-old, but Captain Aldrich had spent his life around warriors. He recognized the steel in the boy's voice. "Fighting is not about anger," he replied. "Angry fighters make mistakes." "Dead fighters. You want revenge, boy?" "I want justice," Cale corrected him. "There are men who burn villages and kill innocent people. Someone needs to stop them." The captain was impressed by the boy's answer. Over the next 3 days, he tested Cale in various ways. He taught him basic sword movements and was amazed at how quickly the boy learned. He told him stories of famous battles and watched how carefully Cale listened to every detail. Most importantly, he saw that underneath the boy's determination was a true desire to protect others, not just to satisfy his own need for revenge. Before leaving town, Captain Aldrich made Cale an offer that would change everything. "There is a place," he said, "far to the east where boys like you can learn to become real warriors. It is not easy. Many who go there do not survive the training, but those who do become the finest fighters in all the lands. Would you go if I could arrange it?" Cale didn't hesitate. Yes. Convincing Elena to let her son go was much harder. She had already lost her husband, and the thought of losing Cale too was almost unbearable. But Roberto surprised everyone by supporting the boy's decision. "He will never be happy here," the carpenter told his wife's sister. "Every day he grows more restless. Better to let him find his path than to watch him waste away dreaming of what might be." 3 weeks later, Cale said goodbye to his mother and followed Captain Aldrich eastward toward the Ironhold Academy, a fortress school hidden in the mountains where the kingdom's elite warriors were trained. The journey took nearly a month on foot, traveling through forests and across rivers that Cale had never imagined existed. The academy was built into the side of a steep mountain, its gray stone walls rising like cliffs toward the sky. Inside those walls, boys from across the kingdom trained under the most demanding conditions imaginable. They woke before dawn for weapons practice. They spent hours each day learning strategy and tactics. They were pushed to their physical and mental limits every single day. Master Garrett, the academy's chief instructor, was a giant of a man with arms like tree trunks and a voice that could be heard across the entire fortress. He took one look at Cale and frowned. "This one is too small," he told Captain Aldrich. "And too young. Send him home before he gets himself killed." But Cale stepped forward boldly. "Give me a chance to prove myself," he said. 1 month. If I cannot keep up with the other students, I will leave without complaint." Something in the boy's tone made Master Garrett pause. He had trained hundreds of young warriors, and most of them came from noble families who sent their sons to learn fighting as a gentleman's skill. This ragged boy from a burned village was different. There was a hunger in his eyes that reminded the master of his own early days as a warrior. 1 month, Master Garrett agreed, but you will receive no special treatment because of your age or size. You will train with boys 3 and 4 years older than you. If you fall behind, you leave immediately. The first week nearly broke Cale's spirit. The older boys were stronger, faster, and far more experienced with weapons. During sparring sessions, he was knocked down repeatedly, sometimes so hard that he could barely get back up. His hands bled from sword practice. His entire body ached from the constant physical training. Some nights he fell asleep wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. But every time he wanted to quit, Kyle remembered his father's face in the flames. He remembered the cruel laughter of the raiders. He remembered his promise to become strong enough to protect innocent people from such evil. Those memories gave him the strength to get up each morning and face another day of brutal training. Slowly, Kyle began to improve. His small size, which seemed like such a disadvantage, actually helped him in some ways. He was faster than the bigger boys, able to dodge attacks they couldn't avoid. He learned to use his speed and intelligence to overcome opponents who were physically stronger. Most importantly, he never gave up, no matter how badly he was beaten in practice. The other students began to respect his determination. Even those who had initially mocked him for his size started to see that Cale possessed something special. He studied every fighting technique with intense focus. He asked endless questions about strategy and tactics. He practiced long after the official training sessions ended, working alone in the courtyard by moonlight. Master Garrett watched the boy's progress with growing interest. In 30 years of teaching, he had rarely seen such dedication from someone so young. Cale absorbed knowledge like a dry sponge absorbing water. More importantly, he never let success make him arrogant or failure make him bitter. He simply kept working day after day, gradually becoming better. By the end of his first month, Cale had earned his place at the academy. He was still smaller and younger than his classmates, but he was no longer the weakest fighter among them. Master Garrett officially accepted him as a full student, and Cale began the long journey toward becoming the warrior he dreamed of being. The seasons passed, and Cale grew both in body and skill. He learned to fight with sword and spear, bow and dagger. He studied the art of war, learning how great generals had won impossible battles through clever strategy. He discovered that true strength came not just from muscle and speed, but from the ability to think clearly under pressure and inspire others to fight beside you. 7 years had passed since Cale first entered the Ironhold Academy, and the small boy who had arrived broken and angry had grown into a formidable young warrior. At 19, he stood tall and lean, with muscles hardened by countless hours of training. His dark hair was longer now, often tied back during combat practice, but his eyes remained the same, sharp, intelligent, and filled with quiet determination. Kyle had graduated from the academy with the highest honors ever recorded. Master Garrett had proclaimed him the finest student he had ever trained, praising not just his fighting skills but his natural ability to lead others. During his final year, Cale had been appointed as a training instructor for younger students, and they had followed his commands with respect and loyalty. Now, as Kyle prepared to leave the mountain fortress that had been his home for so long, he carried with him something more valuable than his sword or his knowledge of warfare. He carried a reputation. Word of the young warrior's abilities had spread throughout the kingdom. Nobles and merchants alike knew the name of Cale the Ironborn, as his fellow students had nicknamed him for his unbreakable will. Captain Aldrich, now graying and moving more slowly, had come to see Cale off. "You could have a commission in the king's army," the old soldier reminded him. "Any lord in the kingdom would be honored to have you serve as his knight. You could live in comfort and wealth for the rest of your days." Kyle shook his head firmly. "That is not why I learned to fight," he replied. "Comfortable nobles in their castles do not need my protection. There are others who do." The young warrior had never forgotten his true purpose. While other students dreamed of glory and riches, Cale had spent his years planning for something different. He intended to find others like himself, people who had lost everything to bandits and raiders. He would train them to fight and lead them against the evil men who preyed on the innocent. Cale's first stop was the village where he had lived with his aunt and uncle after his father's death. Roberto and Maria wept with joy when they saw how strong and capable he had become. His mother, Elena, now showing gray in her hair, held him close and thanked God for bringing her son safely home. But Kyle could not stay long in the peaceful town. His destiny lay elsewhere. After a week of rest and preparation, he set out alone to begin his real work. He traveled from village to village, always listening for stories of raids and attacks. Wherever he heard of families destroyed by bandits, he went to find the survivors. His first recruit was a young woman named Sarah, whose entire family had been killed by raiders 2 years earlier. She had been working as a servant in a tavern, barely surviving day to day when Kale found her. Sarah was thin and weak from poor food and hard work, but her eyes burned with the same desire for justice that had driven Kale for so many years. "I can teach you to fight," Kale told her. "I can make you strong enough to protect others from what happened to your family. But the training will be harder than anything you have ever experienced. Are you willing?" Sarah's answer was immediate. Yes. Within a month, Kale had found 12 more recruits. There was Marcus, a young man whose village had been burned just like Kale's own childhood home. There was old Tom, a former soldier whose granddaughter had been kidnapped by slavers. There was Anna, barely 16, who had watched her parents murdered by bandits who stole their small farm. Each person who joined Kale's group had lost something precious to evil men. Each carried scars, both visible and hidden, from their experiences. But they also carried something else, a burning desire to ensure that no other innocent families would suffer as they had suffered. Kyle led his small band to a hidden valley deep in the forest, far from any roads or settlements. There, using the skills he had learned at the academy, he began to train his followers in the arts of war. But this was different from the formal instruction he had received as a student. His recruits were older, already shaped by tragedy and loss. They brought an intensity to their training that even impressed their young leader. Day after day, the group practiced with weapons and learned tactics. Kale taught them to move silently through the forest, to set ambushes, and to strike quickly before disappearing again. He shared everything he had learned about strategy and leadership. Most importantly, he taught them to work together as a team, to trust each other completely in battle. As word of Kale's group spread, more recruits arrived. Farmers whose crops had been stolen, merchants who had lost everything to highway robbers, former soldiers who were tired of serving lords who cared nothing for common people. By the end of his first year as a leader, Kale commanded 37 fighters. Their first real battle came when scouts reported a large band of raiders preparing to attack a defenseless village. The bandits numbered over 60 men, well-armed and experienced in violence. Traditional military wisdom would have said that Kale's smaller force had no chance of victory. But Kale had not learned traditional warfare. He had studied every account of battles where smaller armies defeated larger ones. He knew that surprise, speed, and superior tactics could overcome raw numbers. Most importantly, he knew that his fighters had something the raiders lacked, a righteous cause to fight for. The battle plan was carefully crafted. Half of Kale's force would attack the raiders' camp at dawn, creating confusion and drawing their attention. Meanwhile, Kale would lead the other half in a flanking attack from the opposite direction. The raiders would be caught between two forces, unable to organize an effective defense. Everything went exactly as planned. The surprise attack shattered the raiders' morning routine, scattering them in panic. When Kale's second force struck from behind, the bandits found themselves surrounded and outnumbered by enemies who fought with skill and determination they had never encountered before. The battle was over in less than an hour. Of the 60 raiders, 43 were killed and the rest fled into the forest, leaving behind all their stolen goods and weapons. Kale's force suffered only minor injuries, though 3 of his fighters were wounded seriously enough to need several weeks of recovery. But the most important victory was not in the battle itself. Word of Kale's triumph spread quickly throughout the region. Suddenly, bandits and raiders had to worry that their attacks might bring swift and deadly retaliation. More importantly, survivors of previous raids began to seek out Kale's hidden camp, eager to join his growing army of justice. The young leader realized that he was building something larger than he had originally planned. This was not just a small band of fighters seeking revenge. This was the beginning of a movement that could change the balance of power between the innocent and those who preyed upon them. Standing in his forest camp, Surrounded by followers who looked to him for guidance and inspiration, Cale thought about his father's final words. Marcus had told his son to be strong, but he had become something more than strong. He had become a leader who could inspire others to be strong as well. The small boy who had watched his father burn was gone forever, replaced by a warrior capable of protecting countless families from the same fate. 3 years had passed since Cale's first victory against the raiders, and his reputation had grown far beyond what he could have imagined. The hidden forest camp had expanded into a permanent settlement, with wooden buildings, training grounds, and workshops where weapons and armor were crafted. What had started as a small band of survivors seeking justice had transformed into something much larger and more organized. Cale now commanded over 150 fighters, men and women from across the kingdom who had answered his call. They came from every walk of life: former soldiers, displaced farmers, ruined merchants, and countless others who had lost everything to bandits and corrupt nobles. Each brought their own skills and knowledge to strengthen the growing organization that people had begun calling the Iron Legion. The young leader, now 22, had learned that winning battles was only part of building a successful movement. He needed to establish supply lines, create a system of communication between distant groups, and most importantly, develop a network of information that would allow him to strike at enemies before they could harm innocent people. Elena, a former merchant's daughter whose family caravan had been destroyed by highway robbers, had become Cale's chief intelligence gatherer. She was brilliant at organizing the flow of information from their scouts and allies throughout the region. Under her guidance, the Legion learned of planned raids days or even weeks in advance, allowing them to position their forces perfectly. Marcus the Hammer, as he was now known, had grown into Cale's most trusted lieutenant. The young man whose village had been burned commanded the Legion's heavy fighters, warriors who specialized in direct assault tactics. His unit could break enemy formations with devastating charges, but they also had the discipline to retreat quickly when facing superior numbers. Sarah Ironheart led the Legion's scouts and archers. She had transformed from the weak tavern servant Cale had first recruited into a deadly warrior who could put an arrow through a man's eye at 200 paces. Her scouts provided the Legion with eyes and ears throughout the countryside, tracking enemy movements and identifying targets for attack. The Legion's success had not gone unnoticed by the kingdom's nobility. Several lords had sent messages offering Cale official commissions and substantial payments if he would bring his fighters into royal service. But Cale refused every offer. He had seen too many examples of nobles who cared nothing for common people, who would use his warriors to protect their own wealth, while ignoring the suffering of farmers and merchants. "We serve the innocent," Cale would tell anyone who asked about his loyalty, "not those who live in comfort while others suffer." This independence had made the Legion some powerful enemies. Lord Blackwood, whose lands bordered the forest where Cale's main camp was located, had grown increasingly frustrated with the young warrior's activities. Many of the raiders who plagued the region had been paying protection money to Blackwood's corrupt officials. The Legion's attacks on these bandits were cutting into the Lord's illegal profits. Conflict came to a head when Cale's scouts discovered that Lord Blackwood was planning to attack their forest stronghold. With a force of 200 professional soldiers, the Lord intended to wipe out the Legion completely and claim credit for destroying a dangerous band of outlaws. He had convinced several neighboring nobles to support him by claiming that Cale's fighters were nothing more than rebels who threatened the kingdom's stability. For the first time since forming the Legion, Cale faced an enemy that he could not simply outfight through superior tactics. Lord Blackwood's soldiers were well-trained and heavily armed. They knew the local terrain and had the resources to maintain a long siege if necessary. Most dangerously, they had the backing of the kingdom's legal authority, which meant that defeating them might brand the Legion as traitors. Cale called together his senior commanders to discuss their options. Some argued for abandoning the forest camp and scattering into smaller groups that could continue fighting as guerrillas. Others wanted to launch a preemptive attack on Lord Blackwood's castle before his forces could mobilize. A few even suggested trying to negotiate some kind of agreement that would allow the Legion to continue operating with official approval. But Cale had a different idea. He had been thinking for months about expanding the Legion's activities beyond their immediate region. There were reports of bandit activity and corruption throughout the kingdom, far more than his current force could handle. Instead of waiting for Lord Blackwood to attack, Kale proposed something unprecedented. "We will divide our force," he announced to his commanders. "I will take 50 of our best fighters and move south, where the mountain clans have been raiding farming villages. Marcus will lead another 50 west, where the river pirates have been attacking merchant boats. Sarah will take 25 scouts and establish a new base in the eastern forests, where she can train local volunteers." The plan was audacious and risky. By splitting their forces, the Legion would be weaker in any single engagement. But it would also allow them to strike at multiple enemies simultaneously, while making it much harder for Lord Blackwood to destroy them all at once. More importantly, it would begin the expansion that Kale had been planning since his first victories. Elena raised the most important concern. How will we coordinate attacks across such distances? How will we know if one group needs help from the others? Kale had been working on this problem for months. Drawing from his studies at the academy, he had developed a system of signal fires and messenger routes that would allow the scattered groups to communicate quickly. He had also identified local allies in each region, village leaders, honest merchants, and former soldiers, who could provide support and information to Legion forces. The greatest challenge was maintaining unity and discipline among fighters who would be operating independently for months at a time. Kale had spent years building the loyalty and trust that held the Legion together. Now he would have to trust his commanders to maintain that same spirit while leading their own forces far from his direct supervision. Before implementing the plan, Kale called together every member of the Legion for a final gathering. Standing before the assembled warriors in the main training ground, he reminded them of why they had joined his cause and what they were fighting to achieve. "We began as strangers brought together by loss and anger," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "But we have become something more. We are a family united by a common purpose. When you go forth to new battles in distant lands, remember that you carry with you the strength and courage of every person standing here tonight." The speech continued for nearly an hour, but nobody grew restless or impatient. These warriors had followed Kale through 3 years of dangerous battles, because they believed in his vision of a world where the innocent could live without fear. They trusted him completely, and that trust would sustain them through the challenges ahead. As dawn broke the next morning, the Legion began its great dispersal. Kale watched his fighters march away in different directions, carrying with them everything they had learned about warfare and justice. Some he might not see again for months or even years. Others might not survive the battles that awaited them. But as he prepared to lead his own group southward toward the mountain territories, Kale felt no doubt about the path he had chosen. The small boy who had once watched his father burn had become a man capable of inspiring hundreds of others to fight for what was right. The Legion would grow and spread, carrying its message of justice to every corner of the kingdom where evil men preyed upon the innocent. 2 years had passed since the Legion's great dispersal, and Kale's bold strategy had proven more successful than even he had dared to hope. Reports reached him regularly from Marcus, Sarah, and the other commanders leading independent forces across the kingdom. Everywhere they went, the Legion's reputation preceded them, and new volunteers flocked to join their cause. Kale himself had established a new stronghold in the southern mountains, where his force had grown to nearly 200 fighters. The mountain clans that had terrorized farming villages for generations had been systematically hunted down and destroyed. More importantly, Kyle had forged alliances with several honest clan leaders who had grown tired of their people's reputation for violence and theft. Chief Rowan of the Eagle clan had become one of Kale's most valuable allies. The grizzled mountain warrior commanded the loyalty of over 300 clansmen, and he had pledged them to support the Legion's mission. "For too long we have been known only for our raids and feuds," Rowan had told Kale during their first meeting. "Help us find a better path, and we will follow you into any battle." The addition of the mountain clans had transformed the Legion from a collection of individual fighters into something approaching a true army. The clansmen brought with them knowledge of mountain warfare and survival skills that proved invaluable. They also provided the Legion with secure supply routes through treacherous terrain that few other forces could navigate. But Kale's greatest triumph had come through an unexpected alliance. Word had reached him that Princess Catherine, the king's younger sister, had grown disgusted with the corruption she saw among the kingdom's nobles. Unlike her brother, who seemed content to ignore the suffering of common people, Catherine had been secretly funding efforts to help villages defend themselves against bandits. The Meeting between Kale and the princess had been arranged through careful negotiations involving Elena's intelligence network. It took place in a remote monastery, neutral ground where both could speak freely without fear of being overheard by hostile ears. Kyle had expected to meet a sheltered noble who knew nothing of real warfare, but Princess Catherine surprised him completely. "I have been watching your legion's activities for over a year," she told him directly. "You have accomplished more to protect innocent people than my brother's entire army. The kingdom needs leaders like you, not the corrupt fools who currently advise the crown." Catherine was not just offering her political support. She commanded significant resources, including a network of loyal nobles who shared her concerns about the kingdom's direction. More importantly, she could provide the legion with something they had always lacked: legitimacy. With the princess's backing, Kale's fighters would no longer be outlaws operating outside the law. The alliance was formalized with a document that Catherine had drafted herself. The legion would become the royal guard for the protection of common folk, with Kale holding the official rank of marshal. This new status would allow them to operate openly throughout the kingdom, recruiting volunteers and establishing permanent bases without fear of legal persecution. News of the Legion's official recognition spread quickly, and the response was overwhelming. Kale found himself receiving messages from honest officials in distant provinces, all reporting bandit activity and requesting Legion assistance. Former soldiers who had been reluctant to join an outlaw organization now volunteered eagerly to serve under royal authority. Within 6 months of gaining Princess Catherine's support, the Legion had grown to over 800 active fighters spread across the kingdom. But with this expansion came new challenges that tested Kale's leadership abilities in ways he had never experienced before. The most serious problem was maintaining the Legion's original principles while operating on such a large scale. When Kale had commanded 50 fighters in a forest camp, he could personally know every member and ensure they upheld his standards of conduct. With hundreds of warriors scattered across vast territories, it became much harder to prevent corruption and abuse of power. Reports reached Kale of Legion forces that had begun demanding payment from villages for protection, little different from the bandits they were supposed to fight. Other groups had grown too comfortable with their authority, treating local officials with arrogance and disrespect. Most troubling were accounts of Legion fighters who had used their positions to settle personal grudges rather than pursuing genuine justice. Kale realized that his organization was facing the same challenges that had corrupted many noble houses and military units throughout history. Success and power had the potential to transform his idealistic fighters into the very type of oppressors they had originally opposed. If he could not solve this problem, the Legion would become just another group of armed men serving their own interests rather than protecting the innocent. The solution came through a combination of innovative organization and ruthless enforcement of standards. Kale established a system of rotating commands, ensuring that no single leader controlled the same territory for more than 2 years. He created an internal investigation unit, led by trusted veterans who had the authority to remove corrupt commanders and redistribute their forces. Most importantly, he instituted the Sacred Oath, a ceremony where every Legion member publicly swore to uphold the organization's founding principles. The oath was not just words. It was backed by specific punishments for violations, including expulsion from the Legion for serious offenses. Kale made it clear that he would rather command a smaller force of honorable fighters than a large army of corrupt soldiers. The true test of these new systems came when Kale learned that Lord Blackwood, his old enemy, was planning a massive campaign to destroy the Legion once and for all. The corrupt noble had convinced several neighboring lords to join him, arguing that the Legion's growing power threatened the traditional authority of the nobility. Their combined force would number over 1,500 professional soldiers, the largest army assembled in the region for decades. But Kale was no longer the young leader commanding a small band of desperate survivors. He now had access to Princess Catherine's intelligence network, which provided detailed information about enemy plans and movements. He commanded seasoned fighters who had won dozens of battles against impossible odds. Most importantly, he had the support of countless common people throughout the kingdom who saw the Legion as their protection against both bandits and corrupt nobles. The campaign that followed would become known as the War of the Iron Crown, though no actual crown was at stake. It was fought across multiple provinces over the course of 8 months, involving dozens of separate battles and sieges. Lord Blackwood's forces had superior numbers and equipment, but they faced enemies who knew every forest path and mountain trail, who could disappear into the countryside and reappear behind enemy lines without warning. Cale's strategy was to avoid large-scale battles where the enemy's numerical advantage would be decisive. Instead, he coordinated attacks by multiple Legion forces against isolated enemy units, gradually wearing down Blackwood's army through constant harassment and ambush. The Legion's superior mobility and knowledge of local terrain allowed them to strike without warning and disappear before enemy reinforcements could arrive. The turning point came during the Battle of Broken Bridge, where Cale personally led 300 Legion fighters against Lord Blackwood's main force. The enemy had been attempting to cross a strategic river when Legion engineers destroyed the bridge, trapping half their army on the wrong side of the water. What followed was a masterpiece of tactical planning, as Cale's forces used the terrain to their advantage, raining arrows down on confused enemy soldiers while preventing any organized counterattack. By the end of the battle, Lord Blackwood himself lay dead, struck down by one of Sarah's arrows as he tried to rally his fleeing troops. The remaining enemy commanders, seeing their cause hopeless, surrendered or fled back to their own territories. The War of the Iron Crown was over, and the Legion had emerged victorious against overwhelming odds. But victory brought Cale no satisfaction. Standing among the bodies scattered across the battlefield, he thought about how far he had traveled from that 7-year-old boy who had watched his father burn. The innocent child who had simply wanted justice had become a military commander responsible for hundreds of deaths. He wondered if his father would have approved of the man his son had become. Princess Catherine arrived at the battlefield 3 days after the fighting ended, bringing with her a royal decree that officially recognized the Legion's authority throughout the kingdom. She also brought news that would change everything once again. The king, Cale's brother, had died unexpectedly, and Catherine was now the rightful heir to the throne. "I want you to serve as my chief military advisor," she told Cale as they walked among the graves where Legion fighters were burying their fallen comrades. "Together we can rebuild this kingdom into something worthy of the people who live in it." It was the ultimate validation of everything Cale had worked to achieve. From a position of official authority, he could expand the Legion's mission across the entire kingdom and beyond. He could establish a system where justice was not dependent on the whims of corrupt nobles, but was guaranteed by law and backed by force when necessary. Yet as he considered the princess's offer, Cale found himself thinking about the simple village where his journey had begun. He remembered his father Marcus, working at his forge and living peacefully among neighbors who trusted him to protect them from harm. The blacksmith had never commanded armies or influenced kings, but he had died protecting the people he loved. Looking out across the battlefield where so many had died fighting for his vision of justice, Cale realized that his real victory was not in defeating Lord Blackwood or gaining royal recognition. His victory was in proving that ordinary people, when united by common cause and properly led, could stand against any oppression. The small boy who had returned from the flames had indeed become a leader of 300 warriors, but more importantly, he had helped kindle a fire of hope that would burn long after his own battles were finished. 5 years had passed since Princess Catherine's coronation as queen, and the kingdom had transformed beyond recognition. Cale, now 29 and bearing the official title of Lord Marshal of the realm, stood on the balcony of his castle overlooking the valley where his childhood village had once existed. Below him, a new settlement thrived, larger and more prosperous than the original had ever been. The Legion, now officially known as the Royal Protectors, numbered over 3,000 active members stationed throughout the kingdom and neighboring lands. But their success was measured not in numbers of fighters, but in the peace that had settled over regions once plagued by constant violence. Bandit raids had become rare occurrences, and corrupt nobles found their illegal activities exposed and punished by forces they could not intimidate or bribe. Queen Catherine had proven to be everything Cale had hoped for in a ruler. She had implemented sweeping reforms that gave common people legal protections previously reserved for the nobility. Her system of royal courts, staffed by honest judges and protected by Legion guards, ensured that justice was available to rich and poor alike. Most importantly, She had established schools throughout the kingdom where children could learn to read and write, giving them opportunities their parents had never imagined. But for all his achievements, Cale found himself increasingly drawn back to the simple life he had known before becoming a famous military leader. He had fulfilled his promise to his father and created a world where innocent families could live without fear. The question that now occupied his thoughts was what to do with the rest of his life. The answer came from an unexpected source. Elena, his former intelligence chief who had married Marcus the Hammer 3 years earlier, brought disturbing news from the kingdom's eastern borders. Refugees were fleeing from a distant empire where a tyrant king had begun enslaving entire populations to build monuments to his own glory. The stories they told reminded Cale painfully of his own childhood trauma. Thousands of families are being torn apart, Elena reported during a council meeting in the royal capital. Children are being forced to work in mines and quarries while their parents are shipped away to build palaces for nobles they will never see. The survivors who reach our borders speak of villages burned and populations scattered, just like what happened here 20 years ago. Queen Catherine looked troubled by the reports. "Our kingdom is finally at peace," she said carefully. "Are you suggesting we should risk that by interfering in the affairs of a distant empire?" But Cale already knew what his answer would be. Looking around the council chamber at the faces of men and women who had followed him through countless battles, he saw that they understood as well. The Legion had been created to protect innocent people from evil, and that mission did not end at any kingdom's borders. "The Legion's purpose has always been larger than any single nation," Cale said quietly. "We swore an oath to stand against oppression wherever we found it. Those children working in foreign mines deserve the same protection we have given to our own people." The debate that followed lasted for hours, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Queen Catherine agreed to provide official support for a Legion expedition to the Eastern Empire, though she insisted it be presented as a humanitarian mission rather than an invasion. Volunteers from throughout the kingdom stepped forward to join the campaign, including many young fighters who had grown up hearing stories of the Legion's early battles. Cale found himself facing the most difficult decision of his adult life. He could remain in the peaceful kingdom he had helped to create, serving as an advisor to a queen who shared his values, and governing a military force that commanded universal respect. Or he could return to the dangerous life of a warrior fighting against impossible odds in foreign lands, where his name meant nothing. The choice became clear when he visited his mother, Elena, now living comfortably in the rebuilt village where she had once struggled to survive. Though she was in her 60s, her mind remained sharp, and she saw immediately what was troubling her son. "You think you should stay here because it is safe," she said as they sat together in her garden. "But safety was never what drove you to become the man you are today. Your father died protecting people he barely knew, because he believed it was the right thing to do. You have spent your life doing the same thing on a much larger scale." She paused to pour tea from a pot that Cale remembered from his childhood, one of the few possessions that had survived the night their village burned. "The question you must ask yourself is not whether you want to go fight in foreign lands. The question is whether you can live with yourself if you do not go." 3 months later, Cale stood at the head of a column of 800 Legion volunteers as they crossed the eastern border into the tyrannical empire. He had resigned his official positions in the kingdom, though Queen Catherine had made it clear that he would always have a place in her service if he chose to return. Sarah Ironheart had assumed command of the remaining protectors, while Marcus the Hammer led a separate force that would follow Cale's expedition after establishing secure supply lines. The campaign that lay ahead would be different. From anything the Legion had attempted before, they would be fighting in unfamiliar territory against enemies who outnumbered them by hundreds to one. They had no local allies and no established intelligence networks. Most dangerously, they would be operating without official support from any government, making them little more than armed raiders in the eyes of their enemies. But as Cale looked back at the faces of the men and women who had chosen to follow him into this uncertain future, he felt the same sense of purpose that had sustained him since childhood. These were not glory-seeking adventurers or soldiers fighting for pay. They were people who had seen too much suffering to ignore the suffering of others. No matter how distant, among his followers was David, a young man whose parents had been killed by the same raiders who destroyed Cale's village 22 years earlier. There was Captain Maria, a former royal guard who had requested transfer to the Legion because she believed their mission was more important than protecting comfortable nobles. Most significantly, there was Thomas, barely 18 years old, who reminded Cale painfully of himself at that age, intense, driven, and carrying scars that would never fully heal. As the column moved deeper into enemy territory, Cale thought about the circle that was completing itself. The terrified child who had watched his father burn had grown into a man capable of inspiring hundreds of others to risk their lives for strangers they would never meet. The boy who had once needed protection had become the protector of countless others. The evening before their first battle in the foreign empire, Cale stood alone outside his tent, looking up at stars that seemed different in this distant land. Somewhere among those stars, he imagined, his father Marcus was watching and perhaps finally understanding what his sacrifice had accomplished. The small boy who had returned from the flames had indeed become a leader of warriors. But more than that, he had become living proof that evil could be defeated by those brave enough to stand against it. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new losses, and new challenges that would test everything the Legion had learned. But tonight, Cale felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who had kept faith with both his father's memory and his own deepest convictions. The fire that had begun in a burning village would continue to spread, carrying light into the darkest corners of the world.